Welcome to Haunted Pages. Today's topic is Death Comes for the Archbishop. There are some books that you remember because of their characters, some because of their stories, and some because of the world they allowed you to inhabit for a little while. When I think about Death Comes for the Archbishop, I remember the land. I remember the vastness of it, the beauty of it. And I remember two men who gave their lives to a calling that would take them across that land and eventually take them away from each other. Death Comes for the Archbishop is a beautiful story about the vocation of two men and the land that holds one of them. But it is also a story about friendship, nature, love, relationships, and the power of God. And ultimately, I think it's a story about what it means to have truly lived. The first thing I have to talk about is the land. Because when I finished this book, that was one of the things I couldn't stop thinking about. Willa Cather's descriptions are breathtaking. The landscape doesn't simply feel like the setting for the story. It feels almost like another character. There is something enormous about this world. The sky, the mountains, the desert, the distance between places. And against all that vastness, Cather gives us these individual human lives. People traveling, people building homes, people worshiping, people trying to find their place in the world. And somehow, the land makes those lives feel both very small and incredibly important. I think that's one reason this novel affected me as much as it did. There is something peaceful about it, but there is also something lonely about it. And that brings me to the relationship that became the emotional center of this book for me. The friendship between Father Latour and Father Valiant is incredible. They are very different men. And honestly, one of the little details that I loved about Father Latour was that he was always in his garden. There's something about the image that stayed with me. This man, who has traveled so far and carried so much responsibility, still finds joy in tending something small. Planting, growing, caring for the earth around him. Father Valiant is different. He isn't the gardener. He's restless in a different way. He needs to go. He needs to preach. He needs to travel wherever he believes he has been called. And yet, these two very different men share something much deeper than personality. They share their faith. They understand one another. They walk through life together. And then comes the moment when their paths have to separate. I think one of the strongest contrasts in Death Comes for the Archbishop is calling versus comfort. Father Valiant is called somewhere else. And even though he may have wanted to remain where he was comfortable with his friend in the life they had built together, he couldn't. He had to go where he was called, no matter the cost. And what makes that especially sad to me is that he couldn't stay for Father Latour either. That doesn't mean their friendship wasn't important. It means the calling was important enough that he had to leave despite the friendship. And Father Latour had to let him go. That's what affected me. because there are really two acts of obedience happening here. Valiant has to obey by going. Latour has to obey by staying. One man's calling requires movement. The other's eventually becomes rooted in place. Neither calling is less important, and neither man's obedience comes without cost. Sometimes loving someone means allowing them to go where they have been called, even when you would rather them stay with you. Father Latour is deeply saddened by the loss of his friend, but he lets him go anyway. To me, there is something incredibly loving about that. There was another moment with Father Latour that stayed with me. He feels the need to go down to the church, and he goes. There, he finds a woman who desperately needs help. That scene affected me because Father Latour listened. His faith isn't simply something he talks about. It isn't simply something he believes intellectually. His faith requires him to respond. He feels that prompting and he acts upon it. And because he does, he is where he needs to be when someone needs him. That is one of the things I think I admire most about both of these men. Their faith is lived. It's imperfect because they're human, but it directs their lives. And I think that leads to the question at the heart of this novel for me. What are we willing to give up? What are we willing to give up in order to follow God? Sometimes God asks us to step out. Sometimes he asks us to leave behind something comfortable. And sometimes he asks us to be willing to give up everything. Because ultimately, he is the one in control. We are not. And I think that's something that's very difficult for us. We like our plans. We like knowing where we're going. We like deciding what our lives are supposed to look like. And sometimes we will keep trying to lead until we finally reach our breaking point. Until we eventually have to say, Lord, it's you. I can't do this on my own. We have to surrender and we have to obey. Because I believe true faith lies in complete obedience. Not only when God's calling looks like what we expected. Not only when it takes us somewhere comfortable. Not only when obedience allows us to keep everything we already love. But even when our calling isn't what we thought it was supposed to be. Father Valiant has to go. Father Latour has to let him. And both require faith. One of the things Death Comes for the Archbishop quietly taught me is that there is a kind of happiness that comes from knowing you are doing what you were called to do. And I don't mean that following your calling makes life easy. These men certainly don't have easy lives. They experience hardship, loneliness, separation, exhaustion. Following their calling costs them something. But there is a difference between an easy life and a fulfilling life. I think we can spend years trying to force ourselves into places where we don't belong. We can spend years doing something we were never meant to do and wondering why we are miserable. But when we finally surrender and follow the calling God has placed on our lives, there is a kind of contentment there that comfort alone cannot give us. And maybe that's part of what makes a life worthwhile. Not that we accomplished everything we planned, not that everything turned out exactly the way we expected, but that when we were called, we were willing to answer. There is one moment from this book that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. Near the end, there is a line about dying, not from illness, but from having lived. That is so profound to me, because I want to be able to say that. I want to have lived. I don't simply want to reach the end of my life and know that I existed. I want to have lived. I want to know that when God called me somewhere, I went. That when He asked me to stay, I stayed. That when He placed people in my life, I loved them. That I noticed the beauty He put around me. That I stopped long enough to see the land. That I tended the garden. That I loved my friends enough to hold them close when I could and let them go when I had to. And that when following Him required me to leave something comfortable behind, I trusted Him enough to do it. Maybe that's what Father Latour's life ultimately represents to me. Not a perfect life, not an easy life, but a life that was lived. And perhaps that's what death comes for the Archbishop quietly asks of us. When we reach the end, will we be able to say the same? Each story leaves a trace, sometimes as warning, sometimes as invitation.